Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Awaken Online series on Stories, Crisis and Community, Episode 2. My name is Rania and Dr. I'm part of the NB team and I'm going to be your host for this evening. I'm going to be facilitating tonight's discussion with our very exciting discussion and guest speakers that we have prepared for you. But before I introduce them, I'm just going to quickly introduce Envy for those of you who might not be familiar with us or the Awaken program. So Envy is a civil society organization. We've been operating in Kuwait for over 10 years now, working on mobilizing and connecting change makers across sectors and addressing shared challenges through creative programs that we co-design with the community. And our aim is to promote a more compassionate, innovative, and sustainable society. And Awaken is kind of my favorite program and a lot of our favorite program because it is a multidisciplinary platform that hosts a series of creative happenings, festivals, conversations, immersive experiences, all based around or with the aim of community building with storytelling at its core. And so before I move forward, I also want to get a chance to introduce Elisa and Eleanor, our fearless leader and my teammate. So if you guys could just pop in and say hello so everyone can see you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Elisa.
Hi, I'm Eleanor.
Awesome. Okay, so today we have episode 2 of the online series. So this is part of a larger series. As some of you might know, we've already hosted one episode last Monday and we'll be hosting another one next Monday. We really believe in the power of stories at Envy and their role in systems change. And we can see how in times of crisis like these, how important a role stories play in building or breaking communities. And so we thought that this would really be an ideal time to step back and think more critically about what stories mean, who tells them, and how they can be used for more social good. So in the first episode last week, we had our guest speakers, Fatma Qadfan and Ghzail Al-Harbi, and we really looked at more of the transformative and healing power of stories and the role that they play in personal and collective trauma and in empowerment and creating shared meaning. And today we're going to be joined by the Al-Nakib sisters for the second episode, which is going to be called or focused around who owns your story. So this is kind of looking more at the stories that we tell about ourselves, about each other, and starting the process of questioning how and why that came to be. So we're so excited to have Dr. Raniel Nakhib, the Assistant Professor of Education at Gulf University of Science and Technology. Rania, if you could just pop in and say hello so everyone can see you.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be here.
Ooh. Is there a lag on my part or you guys?
I think it was yours, Leanne.
Yeah, it's you, Leanne.
Okay,
Hello.
Leanne, are you there?
Sorry, I think my connection.
Okay, we would also like to welcome Professor Raniel Nakhib to our discussion tonight. May, can you wave so people can see you?
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
And Farah Al-Nakib, Professor Farah Al-Nakib, who is actually in California early in the morning, has woken up to also join us for this discussion, which we're very excited that you joined us from the States and got up early to do this. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here and be able to join you guys this morning or evening, your time.
Thank you, Eleanor. Sorry, my connection seemed to disconnect for a second there. We're going to try to jump in and out and co-facilitate so we can try to navigate the internet connectivity. As you guys know, it's a bit tricky right now. So just to jump back, this collaboration is very special to us all. Both Rania and May have played a really big role in the past Awaken festivals. They've always enriched our conversations and all the work that we do at Envy with their questions around identity and tradition, censorship and education. And of course, with Farah, it's very exciting for me to have her as part of the conversation because she's been a personal mentor and teacher to me during my undergraduate experience at AUK. So thank you guys so much for joining us once again. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. We want to keep tonight's conversation and webinar organic. We want to create space for our guests to really have a conversation that we can all listen into and ask questions along the way. So we will all be trying our best to maintain a very light facilitation. For the attendees that are listening in, you guys, we would love for you to also be a part of the conversation. If you could just take a look at the bottom of your screen, you're going to find a Q&A section. And you can actually use that to upload your questions. So if you have any questions that you want to ask to any of the guest speakers or the facilitators, feel free to do that throughout our conversation. And we will try to address as many of your questions as we can throughout the discussion, or perhaps towards the end of it. And another cool feature that you guys can use is if there are any questions that someone posts which you particularly like and want to hear the answer to, then you can upvote it by clicking the thumbs up button, which is also there in your Q&A section. Otherwise, we will also try to keep the conversation as real as possible. Please remember, just like any of our other Envy or Awakened spaces, discomfort is okay, as long as we are listening intently to one another and holding space for another's stories and insights with compassion and respect, then please feel free to have a role and contribute your questions to this conversation. Okay, so now we will move forward with the questions so that I can finally give you guys the space to have your conversation. So I'm just going to start off with a really quick question that I want to ask. I'm going to have a specific question that I want to ask with all of you individually, so we can kickstart the conversation. So just to give a bit more context, in our first episode, as I mentioned earlier with Ghzail and Fatma, our conversation was strongly focused around defining the concepts and meaning of stories, of myth and narrative, and the powerful roles that they each play in our experiences of our own selves and one another. And so in our conversation, we really started to look more deeply at the process of myth creation, which, to put very simply, was defined by Ghzail as a narrative that is repeatedly told and passed on as truth. So I thought it would be a good idea to kick off our conversation today by defining the role of myth and narrative more specifically within the Kuwaiti context, exploring the central role that they've played and continue to play in the creation of the public narrative that really drives and dictates the way that we operate as a society and our interactions with each other, our access to space. And so Farah, if I could start with a question for you, could you perhaps give us a bit more context on how or when the myth of the Kuwaiti story has come to be from more of a historical perspective, and also what it looks like? Who does it represent or misrepresent, and what factors inspired its creation?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, again, thank you to everybody and to Envy and Awaken, for inviting us for this webinar today. And Lan, I think that's a really important starting point and question. Of course, all nations have their origin stories or their founding myths, to use that term. And these are usually constructed as a key part of the nation building process. And these are the stories that get told in official narratives such as school history courses, national museums, and so on. So Kuwait's founding myth really tells the story of a group of core families who were led by the current ruling family that migrated from Central Arabia in the 18th century and settled on the shores of what we now call Kuwait City. And they engaged in trading and pearling, and over time grew to become a large, prosperous, hardworking community, and one that is usually characterized as relatively homogenous and cohesive. And one of the main stories that you hear that symbolizes the strength and will of this community is the Battle of Jedha in 1920, when the townspeople came together to fight off the Ikhwan tribes of Najd and built the wall to protect the town from attack. And this wall, or the sur as it was known as, which was demolished in 1957 with the advent of oil and the development of the city, has served as a very powerful symbol of Kuwait's independence and nationhood, the story of Kuwait's nationhood ever since. Now, the problem with these origin stories or founding myths is that while on the one hand, they're often based on elements of truth, Kuwait really was a relatively close-knit community before oil. The Battle of Jedha, the building of the wall really did happen in 1920. These stories are also often oversimplified and leave a lot out. So, for instance, one of my objectives in the earlier chapters of my book, where I examined what urban life in Kuwait was like before oil, was to more critically analyze these stories of community that you so often hear. And so, for instance, the prevailing historical narratives tend to suggest that the pre-oil Kuwaiti community was close-knit, because it was homogenous, that everybody knew each other and lived more or less similar lifestyles, that everyone took care of each other. The townspeople stood ready to protect themselves and each other from outsiders and so on. And what I discovered, primarily by conducting oral histories with people who had been alive at that time, from hearing their own more personal stories and narratives, is that the sense of connectedness people might have felt with their neighbors, for instance, was not a product of their sameness or sense of obligation to one another, but was fundamentally underpinned by the realities of scarcity and hardship in the days before affluence. So people needed each other to survive at a time when there was no state or much public welfare to fall back on. And I think it's important to remember that history, because then it begs the question, so what replaces that sense of community when that mutual need for moral and material support is removed, as it was after the advent of oil? And then as for something like the Battle of Jedha, for instance, in my work, I've also specifically analyzed how that story is usually told in different Kuwaiti contexts. And the prevailing narrative, again, tends to emphasize that the townspeople built a wall to protect Kuwait from some ambiguous attack coming from the desert. And it's not always told or known who this enemy actually was. The Ikhwan tribes of Najd, who are trying to force Kuwaiti tribes to shift their loyalty to Ibn Saud. And so the wall still, therefore, stands as a very powerful symbol that divides, for instance, the townspeople in Kuwait, who are now known as the Hadar, from the desert and the Bedouin who roamed beyond its gates. And to understand how much this highly simplified version of the story has become part of Kuwait's origin myths, one needs only to remember the journalist, for instance, Mohammed Al-Juwayhil, who commented in 2009 on his private satellite channel, aptly named As-Sur, when he claimed that only Kuwaitis who had been settled before oil, those who had fought in the Battle of Jedha and built the wall, were true Kuwaitis, whereas he says newcomers, namely, for instance, the tribes, were not a part of that historical association. And so here we start to see then, Lan, you asked like who these origin stories might include and who they might exclude. The myth that Kuwaiti society was somehow homogenous before oil elides the fact that Kuwait was established as a society of immigrants, that there was no indigenous community here before the town was settled in the early 18th century, and everyone at some point came from somewhere else, be it Najd, Iran, Iraq, Zanzibar, Baluchistan, etc. But today there is a strong tendency among Kuwaitis to say that we need to protect our identity, our adatna wa taqalidna, our customs and traditions from foreign influences, as if Kuwaiti society has ever shared a singular, homogenous, or unchanging cultural identity or narrative that is now under threat. The one thing we can accurately say about our historical identity as a society is the very fact that it has always been heterogeneous, that we've always absorbed cultural influences from other places in which we've been in contact, like the Indian Ocean and so on. But again, our origin myths erase those multiple traces and stories and instead emphasize homogeneity, sameness, cohesion. This notion that fitna or any threat to national cohesion, like the statements made by Al-Juwayhil, can be punishable by law in Kuwait. But national unity can't be created by telling stories that emphasize our sameness, right? Only through recognition and acceptance of our differences. So as my final point, just to get to your question on when these founding myths came about, I don't think there's any specific moment that we can identify, but I think there's multiple different moments and factors. So I would identify, for instance, most importantly, the 1959 Nationality Law, where original Kuwaitis, bit-ta'sis, are those who were settled, mutawattinun fil Kuwait, by 1920. Those who arrived after 1920 could only be naturalized. And as we know, the opportunity for long-term residents to become citizens is severely restricted. And so the law made it very quick and easy to identify insiders from outsiders, settled Kuwaitis from non-settled Kuwaitis, citizens from non-citizens, and so on. And I think what Rania might get into is how citizenship in general serves to homogenize the heterogeneity of a population, but I'll stop there. I think we can pick up these discussions and other points after my sisters have had a chance to talk.
Thank you, Farah. Yeah, there's definitely a lot there that we can unpack. But before we do that, I'll just ask my question to Rania. In your work, you looked more specifically at the education system, and I think a lot of what Dr. Farah just mentioned is almost echoed in the policies that are focused around the education system and the curriculum in Kuwait. So I want to ask you, how does that contribute to the creation of the singular and the fixed Kuwaiti identity or story, if you will, that Farah was just mentioning. And also with other stories, and how does it contribute to other stories and perspectives being perceived as threats to the national unity?
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all of you at Envy for arranging this. I'm really excited to be here. And it's a very good question. And what I'd like to do first, if it's okay, is to sort of look at citizenship education in general before focusing specifically on Kuwait. Because citizenship education, like the idea of citizenship itself, has been interpreted in so many different ways. And what ends up happening is that the resultant tensions often lead to very thin applications of citizenship education. So McLaughlin gives us a very useful way to look at these tensions on a continuum from minimal to maximal interpretations of the notion of citizenship. And then he actually applies this to education. So a minimal view conceptualizes citizenship solely in national legal terms, citizenship as status or as nationality. This view often conflates citizenship with nationalism, promoting a static national identity and expressions of love and loyalty to the state at the expense of deeper political understandings. This legal conception, as it applies to education, has been criticized by many as superficial, as well as marginalizing and homogenizing. It guarantees status without necessarily providing opportunities for participation, and it promotes an imagined national narrative that often excludes various groups. Whereas a more maximal interpretation acknowledges that identity is complex and dynamic. This involves reflection on the multiple communities that an individual identifies with on various levels: local, national, regional, and global, and the consequent development of a consciousness of being part of shared human and democratic cultures or communities. So much bigger than just national. In such a view, people continually redefine their identities. In multicultural societies, individuals born within certain contexts and cultures choose themselves amidst diversity, dialogically, in conversations, in confrontations with others. Culture is not determined, but rather undergoes constant reinterpretation through meaningful engagement with people of diverse histories, cultures, and backgrounds. Recognition within this type of thick interpretation involves acknowledging the existence of diverse cultures and backgrounds, as well as their potential contributions, their struggles for recognition, and any wrongs committed against them. So that would be the ideal thick situation. Now, this kind of engagement and recognition that would be necessary for a thick interpretation of citizenship education is difficult to achieve in Kuwait's schools, to start with, because of the homogeneity. So we have tried to homogenize our schools, whether in part intentionally and in some part accidentally. Our schools are segregated by nationality. So in the public school system, only Kuwaitis are allowed, with a handful of exceptions, which immediately segregates them by religion, right? So you have majority Muslim students. Our schools are also segregated by class. So upper socioeconomic students are often in private schools. So we have split between public and private. They're also segregated by gender, by religious sect, so Sunni Shia, and by cultural backgrounds, often Badu Hadar. So you get majorities within schools because of the district lines as well. So in this kind of environment, difference is made invisible, with groups blind to the struggles of others and to their realities. Opportunities for national identity then is easily highlighted. And the presentation of a single religion secures obedience, and opportunities for criticality are scarce. So because you're in a situation where most people are just like you don't need to engage with the differences, or those kinds of debates don't need to come up as much. And so they're ignored, and you can focus on the national and love of country and loyalty to the country. And the religious focus in the curriculum also facilitates, not being critical and just obeying, while also having a very strong Sunni focus, Sunni focus. In textbooks, stories told from the perspectives of groups like women, Shia, Badu, and expats are excluded and if they're present, they're very, very minimal and whitewashed often. Students are not invited to explore the multiple ways one can be Kuwaiti, one can be Muslim, or one can be a citizen. This leads to singular interpretations and a distrust of any other. Also, like almost surprise about the existence of other perspectives or other ways of being. And I can give examples from my students at some point during our conversation, but examples of how baffled they are that there could be a different way of being Muslim, for example. So if we wanted a more maximal conception of citizenship, then citizens are responsible for actively questioning and extending their immediate realities. In this approach, transformative rather than simply legal citizens act to promote ideals such as justice and equality, even if it violates existing laws. Okay, the aim of education, according to James Banks, is to help students become such transformative citizenship, such transformative citizens. The question is, however, how can we achieve this in our current education system? Because clearly that is not the goal of our education system. We don't really encourage students to speak out and definitely not to speak out against the existing status quo. So I will just leave us with that for now, and then I'll jump in again once we finish with the introductory questions.
Thank you, Rania. Yes, and then my question to May. So you looked at the dangers of censorship, you know, in the work that you do, especially after your collection of stories was banned, and kind of the impact of that process on society at large. So my question to you, May, is: what do you think happens when people are not allowed to tell stories? What are the primary risks of having the single story that both Rania and Farah talk about, that defines us as a society or as individuals? And also, what are the risks of not owning your own narrative, more specifically within the Kuwaiti context, of course?
All right. Thanks, Leanne and Eleanor, for having us here. It's really great to be here and to participate in this and in all the work that you guys do. So there's a lot in that question, Leanne, and I'm going to try to unpack everything quickly. But first, I just want us to be clear what we mean by stories. So stories in this context can mean voice, point of view, background, urgencies, histories, requirements, rights, in addition to the more conventional sense of story as, you know, kind of personal story or even a memoir or whatever else. So we're using story here in a broad sense. Very simply, if people aren't allowed to tell their stories won't be heard. Without a voice, you remain unheard and unseen. So if people's stories are unheard and they remain unseen, their points of view, their urgencies, their rights can't be acknowledged or addressed. So most significantly, if one or more sides of a story remain suppressed, then there can never be mutual understanding between groups. And this touches on many of the things that Rania and Farah already brought up. But one thing to keep in mind these days is that accessibility to social media, self-publishing, podcasting, all of that gives us the ability to tell our stories. It makes our stories more available than ever before. Of course, access is skewed in favor of the wealthier, the more educated sectors, but in general, access is wider. More people are in a position to put their stories out there. The danger, however, is that in the cacophony, their voices will be drowned out. What tends to happen is that we discern the voices and stories that already resonate with us, and unfamiliar or dissonant points of view remain unheard if they don't jive or they don't already jive with our own. So we need to be concerned both about not being allowed to tell our stories, but also about going unheard, even if we do. So I think there are two things there to think about. The primary risk of narrating and iterating a monovocal, undifferentiated story of the nation or of society is that it's inevitably going to be exclusionary and so discriminatory, again, as Rania and Farah both brought up. The more multiple and differentiated our national and social narrative, telling stories in the plural rather than just one dominant story, the more inclusive and tolerant it has the potential to become. This isn't guaranteed, of course, even with the plurality, but the chances are better. The risk of holding on to one narrative of yourself as an individual, because you brought up, which I think is important, not just to think about the general, but also the very specific, in terms of the individual, is that it restricts our chances of changing and growing. It turns you into a rather rigid and restricted person. One of the joys of life, I would say, is about transformation, especially as you get older and hopefully a little wiser. Clinging to one defining story can curtail that transformation or evolution, often to the detriment of those around you. So, for example, men who cling to the story of their masculinity as the dominant narrative about themselves will be hard-pressed to understand the points of view of women or any of those who are at the receiving end of their often toxic masculinity, which is what we're seeing unfold all around us. So another of the things you brought up, Leanne, is what is the risk? So the risk of not owning your own narrative is that others who may not have your best interests in mind will have the power to speak for you. In some cases, we do have to abdicate partial ownership of our story, and even some of our specific interests in order to become part of a group. Sometimes a collective voice can have more power politically, socially, or economically than one lone voice. So some element will likely be lost in this abdication, but often more can be gained. It depends on the stakes. Yet as part of a group, we don't have to lose complete ownership. Ideally, we can still retain the authority to negotiate with like-minded others to come up with plans that can work to our collective benefit. The risk to Kuwaiti society of not hearing the multitude of voices that are everywhere around us, of not having the ears as a society, as a nation, to hear those voices, is its very existence. That sounds apocalyptic, but we're living in apocalyptic times. If we don't hear the voices of experienced economists warning of the country's inability to sustain itself through oil and rent alone, the country will fail. If we don't hear the voices of sociologists warning about the social inequalities that exist in the makeup and demographic of the country will collapse. If we don't hear the voices of human rights advocates advocating for everything from the rights of women, children, migrants, and the Bidun, among others, it will be to the detriment of the ethical fabric of the community and ultimately its sustainability. If we don't hear the voices of scientists warning about the environmental catastrophe that we're experiencing as we speak, then the country, not to mention the planet and everyone on it, will end. So I think that's what's at stake in the risk.
Good times.
Fun times. Fun times.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that there's definitely so much to unpack there. Thank you guys so much for your answers. I know that these were quite heavy layered questions and warranted heavy layered answers as well. It's interesting. All of this reminds me a lot about what the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said in her talk. She framed it very nicely. She talks about the singular story. And the inherent power of holding a single story. And I think that's something that we're seeing a lot in Kuwait, especially right now in a time of crisis. It's knowing only one story about a group inevitably leads us to stereotyping and a lot of racial profiling. So some of you mentioned, especially Rania mentioned, the different communities in Kuwait that more easily fall victim to the single story and some that don't even get a story at all. Can we unpack that a little bit more? Looking at the different groups that are kind of subjugated under this, as Mike put it, monovocal, undifferentiated story of the nation that is very exclusive.
In the context of COVID-19?
Just in general.
Yes, or general. I think general, and then we can move more specific.
Rania, I think that's to you.
Can you just repeat the last part that you wanted us to, the last part of the question that?
about the different kinds of groups that sort of get excluded and left out of this sort of monovocal national narrative that we've sort of all been addressing and talking about.
Yes.
I think the problem. Go ahead.
I mean, I think definitely if we're looking at, for example, in the schools and in our curricula in Kuwait, you know, most people are left out. So women are left out. We present very whitewashed things about women's rights and how women are equal to men. It's very insulting the way it's presented. It just talks about how, well, men or women are equal and there are no differences. It ignores the fact that we don't have equal legal rights. It ignores the struggles of women, the successes of Kuwaiti women. There are very few Kuwaiti women presented as role models. There's they're just absent. And then if you look at other groups, if you look at the Shia, completely marginalized in our books. All of the books have a heavy Islamic influence, but it's a heavily Sunni perspective. If you look at, again, the like Farah was talking about, the history and the national story and the myth of, the nation, a lot of groups, again, are excluded from that. So, and then we're not even looking at the majority of the population, which are the expats. And what that's done is it's rendered people completely invisible to Kuwaiti young people, but Kuwaitis in general. So, and that's, we're seeing that now in this crisis, even, under a larger, like under a magnifying glass, because I think people are not aware of how our stories are interconnected and intertwined. So I'll let Farah and May answer in the general before going to specific examples from the current.
Yeah, I mean, 100% like what Rania was saying. Of course, probably the biggest group that gets excluded from all sort of national narratives and stories from that sort of more collective, let's say, narratives, is the majority of the people who live in the country, which are the non-Kuwaitis, which are expats of different, socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds and so on. And I think a really good example historically, it's just to point out something, one of the stories of the nation that from which they're usually left out, for instance, is the experience of the invasion. Right? When we look at how the story of the invasion is told in Kuwait, whether we're looking at it from the perspective of books or even the museums and things like that, the invasion is something that primarily happened to us as Kuwaitis, right? We don't really think much or talk much about how the invasion impacted and changed the lives of the majority of the people who lived here before the invasion, which were non-Kuwaitis, right? Who experienced the same kinds of shocks and transformations in their lives as Kuwaitis did, right? Who were also victims in many ways of the circumstances of the occupation. But their experiences are not sort of part of when we talk about our national experiences of the invasion. When I worked at AUK, and Leanne, you were obviously a student in one of my classes, but I used to teach a class on oral histories, was precisely to sort of collect different stories and narratives of different kinds of experiences. And one year we had done a class that was specifically on the invasion, and the students collected interviews with people who were specifically with non-Kuwaitis, with people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, from a British manager of a major car dealership to a Filipina nanny, all of whom had experienced these invasions. And the students were shocked. I mean, similar to what Rania, you were saying about sometimes students not even realizing the differences. These were stories of the invasion that they had never heard about, living in refugee. And in fact, to the extent that even the film that came out, it was called Airlift, I think, which tells the story of the Indian community and how they experienced the invasion in Kuwait, was banned in Kuwait. It was not shown in the cinemas here, and it was going to be. And again, it just emphasizes that we have a singular way of looking at this experience that really excludes a vast number of voices and stories and experiences.
So I'm not gonna respond because they covered it. I'll wait for your next question.
Okay, that's very fair. So my next question is what Rania actually mentioned a little earlier. So looking at it more specifically within the context of COVID-19, our world, I think we can all agree that our world has really been turned upside down in record time, and it's on everyone's mind right now. So going back to the title of our webinar, who do you think owns your story in times of crisis? You know,
Yeah.
how can we reclaim it? And if so, how? And this is a question to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question and really resonates in this moment. And all I can think of when you ask that question is that in the time of crisis, the crisis owns your story, at least to begin with. I think that we find that really hard to accept. I mean, we want to claim certainty. We want to draw a boundary around what's happening, to come to some sort of understanding, even to imagine an endpoint, a kind of happily ever after, as someone who thinks about stories, and we want to narrate what's happening because it gives us a sense of control. But in the initial stage of any crisis, I think, while the parameters and the terms of the story are still very much in flux, I think a moment of surrender is necessary, or it's required. So a crisis like this pandemic forces a pause, a suspension, which is really difficult for us to deal with. We're so used to incessant activity, amplified by our constant engagement with, various media. So to be under curfew or quarantine in the second decade of a century that's been defined by global movement, whether, informational, financial, migratory, or whatever else, is a shock to our myriad systems. So we're under arrest as the pandemic travels in our place. I mean, it's a humbling moment, really, but it's not one really I can claim to understand or articulate clearly because it's still in process. So, I mean, all I kind of keep thinking is that in the middle of a crisis may not be the best sense-making or storytelling moment. And that's not to say that we should completely give up ownership of our specific stories, or for that matter, our collective stories, national or global ones among others. But it's just to kind of suggest that a thoughtful, long-sighted narrative about what is still very much in play may not materialize overnight.
Yeah. I agree that right now the coronavirus owns our story because, like she said, we have no idea what's coming and we're all struggling to make sense of things. But I think rather than pausing, as May has suggested we should do, or even looking to the past through literature, again, as May, you've suggested before, many have made arrogant assumptions about their narratives being correct or being the truth or the right way, ignoring, as we often do in Kuwait, again, the multiple realities that we are living and experiencing. Again, the dominant narrative comes from those with privilege, the minority in the country. That's not to say that people from different backgrounds are not engaging in their own storytelling. They are, like May had said. But as usual, the settings and audience seem to be segregated. And I'm seeing a lot of exclusion. For example, in the field of education, as you all know, we've had a very weak response to this crisis from the Ministry of Education, who've gone back and forth about what to do while schools are suspended. Meanwhile, other countries in the region have seemingly left us in the dust, jumping to online platforms very quickly. I have been in numerous discussions about this issue with fellow educators, with colleagues, with fellow parents. There is a clear demand for online education. There's anger, there's passion, there's a sense of disbelief that the country is taking so long to act. I'm a teacher and I'm a mother, and I share their panic for our children to continue to learn through this crisis. But you know what I'm not hearing enough of? I'm not hearing people acknowledge certain things. I'm not hearing people acknowledge that online learning will likely deepen the already existing cleavages in the educational attainment between the various groups of society. I'm not hearing an acknowledgement that not everyone has access to the tools and technology needed for this huge shift. I'm not hearing an acknowledgement about how children with disabilities will need additional resources. I understand and agree that we need to move forward with online learning because, well, I mean, what else can we do? But I think we need to pause, like May said, and reflect as we do, so that when we emerge from this crisis, the cleavages we deepened and those we may have inadvertently left behind are not once again forgotten. I feel like it's really, that's why I think that pause is so important to do and to think as we rush to tell stories and rush to, assume that our story is correct.
I can just jump in and speak, just say also a little bit more generally when it comes to sort of, I think the original question, Lan, that you were asking, like, who owns our story in time of crisis and how can we reclaim it and so on. And I really also think that, and I agree with May's sentiment that we need to pause and really be thinking, but I also think we also need to not only be thinking about how our own lives and stories have been affected and altered by this crisis, by COVID-19, how, we can take back control. I think, yes, there is this desperate sense of wanting to take back control of our lives, of our stories, and so on. But I also think we need to be looking at things from a much wider angled lens as well. One thing that I keep hearing people all over the world saying is that one of the remarkable and sort of unprecedented parts of this crisis is that we're all going through the same thing everywhere in the world. And while that's true to some extent, okay, yes, nobody's traveling. Most of us are under some sort of stay-at-home order. We're all making masks out of scarves or scrambling to get toilet paper. And there are those sort of stories that we keep hearing repeated. But, the deeper reality is that we are experiencing this extremely differently. And we really need to be paying more attention to other people's stories of the crisis and during this crisis to really understand the impact that this is having on the whole world and on all of us. And while I think there is a sort of desire to find those common stories and experiences during this crisis, it can't override the fact that the disparities in the world, are like, Rania was referring even within the context of even just online learning, but in all the different vast ways in which the disparities in the world are being heightened during this crisis. And you look at different places that are experiencing it. I think that's something we need to really focus on, is how different people are experiencing this crisis too.
I completely agree. And I think a strong segue or a thing to attach onto what you just said is a comment that we just got from the attendees from Dalal Faris. She says, excellent discussion, love it. And she says, my question concerns the current proliferation of voices trying to hold on to the singular narrative or truth that excludes others. How do we combat such resistance to diversity and progression? I'm referring to Hayat Al-Fahed's comment on TV and the ongoing discussions online that defend her comments that we need to protect Kuwait against foreigners and otherness. As crisis or COVID-19 brings out the dominant racism, how do we resist that?
I think this goes back to what we said before about so many of our ugliest faults and mistakes as a society have become so magnified. And I think that's coming up as another question. I think like the way those in the service industry in Kuwait, mostly of Southeast Asian nationalities, are invisible to so many Kuwaitis. We see that now in online demands for full curfews so that the foreigners will stop moving around and spreading it to us, right? That's the discourse that's being used. But I don't understand who do the Kuwaitis think are working as cleaners and porters and nurses in hospitals? Who do they think are unpacking all the shipments of cargo coming in? Who do they think is delivering food to stores? Who's keeping all the services running right now, on and on and on? They don't think about it because to them it's simple. There is them and there is us. And if we stay separate, then we won't get sick. They do not see our fates and our stories as interconnected and intertwined. And this has always been the case. And that's how we ended up with the kafala system and our stringent nationality laws, because there's always been this perceived separation. And now what we're starting to understand is we're not separated. We are one community and we are one population, and we're living together. And there is no separation, and it does end up becoming very ugly and very racist and very disturbing, because the people are complaining about are the people doing all the work as well, right? So it's just a mess.
And I think actually, Rania, I remember when all of this started to happen, almost at the beginning, before I heard this coming out, other people bring up the same point. But one thing you said that really resonated with me is that you said this experience, this pandemic is bringing out all the faults, all the fault lines. And you were talking about, personal things, to social relationships, to societal, and I think, Leanne, you also, when you gave us some of your leading questions, you asked this, Rania, you hinted at this idea of how this is going to illuminate already existing fault lines. And we're seeing this, I'm sure we're seeing this individually in ourselves, things that bother us about ourselves that it's bringing out. It's taking it to the level beyond that, the social, which is what Delal's question was addressing, social, the racist elements that come out that Rania is talking about. What I kind of said is that if you're not heard, you're not seen. And I think that we see that really clearly, in what's going on. Literally the people that are, driving existence are invisible in many ways, not only in Kuwait. I think this is something that is really global. And I do think that this pandemic is illuminating, is bringing out the stories that are unheard, how we can resist the tendency to, again, suppress them or push them down in the name of, again, a national narrative. My sense, again, in the same way that I said about that the story is owned by the pandemic or by the crisis, is that this illumination cannot be made dark again. It just can't be. It's still going to continue because, as Rania said, we are completely inextricably connected to the people in our community, whether we like it or not. And whether you make statements or don't, there is nothing that can be done. It is all going to be unearthed, and we're all going to be experiencing the effects of all of that now, all together. And so there's nothing that can be done. It's not in our hands. So people can say whatever they want and they can make arguments, but nothing can be done about it. So it's not in our hands, which is very uncomfortable, and it's very unusual, and it's very interesting. I mean, from the point of view of a cultural critic, it's like,
Can I jump in here? I don't know if you can hear me.
Mm-hmm. We can.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in here sort of from the perspective of envy, because so the work that we are really focused on is how do you build the social fabric, right? How do you bring people together so that you create a community that has the resilience to respond to crisis, right? That's what a resilient, sustainable community does. And so you do that by bringing together people from different walks of life, different experiences, different genders, different socioeconomic groups, nationalities, religious groups. And it's tiny work, like you do it relationship by relationship, program by program, really inviting in insight after insight. And so what happened when COVID hit for us was suddenly all of those networks that we had nurtured made us able to bring people together to work on a response for the most marginalized non-Arabic speaking migrant communities. And what came out of that has been just a sort of a beautiful sort of thing. It hasn't been about people being charity driven or getting merits or whatever. It has really been about centering the focus of the conversation on those people that have been the most affected. So the people that would be at most food risk, that would be most vulnerable, and having them come to the center of the conversation and map everything and then tell those stories to the different people in civil society, the private sector, intergovernmental organizations, so they learn from that and can take those stories and that lived experience and funnel that back up to the recommendations to the ministries to say, you need to see this whole story and how it affects the entire public health question, and think about this in terms of, is it a humanitarian crisis and what choices do you make? My point being that there is, I think, a way that you can respond. I don't think that we're helpless. I think it's very hard work, but I don't think we're helpless. I think that I've watched these people from every nationality in Kuwait step into this circle of community and take on some aspect of responsibility for it. Amazing, amazing. And really listen to each other. So for me, I think the response to future crises, to things coming up, is really looking at that grassroots community building and really letting people talk to each other and really share their lived experience with each other and learn from each other and see each other's resources and leverage that. So
I don't actually, I don't mean to suggest at all that we are helpless or that there's nothing to be done or that the crisis is going to bulldoze over justice or transformation. Actually, the opposite. My sense is just that if we think that the dominant narratives, whether they're racist or hyper-nationalist, whatever they are, all over, by the way, in Kuwait, but way beyond, we're seeing this everywhere. I actually think that the pandemic is going to, I don't think the tendency in the end will be to heighten that, which is actually what did happen after the 1918 pandemic, right? So in 1918 pandemic, one of the results one could argue is that it pushed eventually, that's not the only reason, of course, but into the depression, and then eventually we know what happens, right? And so the rise
into the war,
fascism and so on. So we're in a similar situation where you have this happening. You're going to have some kind of economic collapse. Usually, often with economic collapses, you end up having, hyper-nationalism and the rest of what we're seeing. We've already been seeing all of that even before the pandemic. It could go that way, but it could go a different way. It could go the way that you're talking about, Eleanor. And I also, I still, the thing is, I hesitate because I just don't know. I feel that we want it, we can be hopeful, we can work, there are lots of things that we can do. But I also think that there is much that isn't in our hands, and we don't like that feeling. But I do think, to be realistic, there is still so much that is nebulous about what's happening. And the more we know, Farah, is a historian, the more we know about what happened before, the more we turn back. I don't think that this word unprecedented bothers me so much, because I do not think that's what's happening is so unprecedented, and that there is no information to how we deal with this and how we move forward. We have loads of things written from the ancient Greeks, even before, onward, to deal with what we're going through. We are not the first. But we need to have the patience and the interest, the motivation to kind of probe what can we learn from history, even recent history.
Yeah,
I can jump in on that point as well, because and I agree with everything May just said. And even if we're going to be looking at it again just from the perspective of Kuwait, right? We have something very recent in our history, right? If we're looking at the invasion. And because a lot of the challenges or threats that we were just talking about in terms of pushing into, can this generate or it exposes all of those fault lines and all of those problems that we have, and the xenophobia and the divisions between Kuwaitis and non-Kuwaitis and so on that are prevalent. Definitely the invasion exposed all of those problems and fault lines as well. The invasion shed light on the disaster of our kafala system, right? The fact that there were thousands and thousands of workers who were left without their passports when their kafil was out of town. So, there was a lot that, looking back in our own recent history at the invasion, I think the difference there was, though, is that the invasion, there was this sort of, because I see one of the questions had asked to hear feedback on national identity and social transformations in Kuwait after the Gulf War. Kuwait did go into a period of hyper-nationalism after the Gulf War. Again, we talk about the invasion as from the perspective of victimhood. May has written a lot about, and we've all sort of talked about before, and the loss of the Palestinian community in Kuwait, who were sort of scapegoated after the liberation as being, one of those targets. And so there was this sense of Kuwaitis being under siege from all directions. I think the difference now is that the virus is not discriminating, right? The virus is not choosing between Kuwaitis, non-Kuwaitis, or Kuwaitis and the rest of the world, right? This is a global pandemic. But I think even if we were just to look at the invasion to see how do we respond then afterwards, and not to, fixing our lives after the crisis, but of those systems that we know are failing and are not working in our like the kafala system and these other things that are there. How can we look back at the invasion and see what we didn't do afterwards, and how we the response that we had after the invasion was, let's quickly go back as soon as we can to what life was like before. Let's quickly brush it under the rug. Let's, economically, in every aspect, everything was completely rebuilt so fast that we completely forgot the invasion had happened. And people look back and nostalgically talk about the sense of community and the togetherness and the help that people were doing during the occupation, but that was all sort of eliminated to rush to get back to what life was like before. We're not going to have that luxury and option after this.
And I think for a lot of people who actually lived in the invasion, that was very disappointing. There was a big feeling of being let down after all of that they went through. I don't know that I'm a bit more pessimistic about, people keep saying that it's going to be, there's no way to go back to the way things were, and that no, that's not an option, and everything's going to be better and changed, or whatever. I don't know. I feel like I'm worried that we may again focus on the wrong kind of thing. I'll speak for education because that's my field. I feel like our biggest thing we're going to focus on coming out of this is going to be like online learning and technologies and teacher training in online platforms and all of that, which is not a bad thing. But to me, that shouldn't be the main thing, right? So many of the problems we're seeing right now are direct or indirect results of much more profound failures in our education system. So I hope we address those. I hope we focus on teaching ethics so that people don't continue to profit by taking advantage of people's poverty. I hope we focus on desegregating our schools so that the Kuwaitis living in huge villas with gardens and pools and farms and chalets come to hear the stories of those living in small, tiny, shared apartments during the quarantine. I hope we focus on teaching history, so like Farah says, that the mistakes we made post-invasion will not be repeated post-COVID-19, right? So I hope that coming out, we focus on the things that matter. Like I'm not so sure that we're not going to make the same mistakes that we made post-invasion and try to sweep a lot of this under the rug. I don't think there are a lot that we won't be able to, but I'm worried there's going to be a lot that we might still try to.
I think actually, Rania, that the economic situation, the economic reality of what's coming is not going to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
And I don't, and again, I know I kind of, I'm on the side of Eleanor's optimism and hope, which is so important, for activism and transformation, social transformation, and the fight for justice. But as again, as someone with a view that I look back and I read, and it's a little bit frightening. It is not a little bit; it's very frightening that these kinds of things tend to go badly before they go well. Which is not to say but also things are accelerated in the world that we live in. Things that took 50 years now take maybe 5, or 10. And that might be a good thing. And I think one of the things that Leanne mentioned was youth. And I think this could be part of where youth comes in, and their optimism and their desire and their values. And I do think, let's say, at least 50% of youth have their values in the right place, and they're not waiting for anybody's permission to make things better. So I think that opportunity, both in Kuwait and beyond, is something to really hold and to kind of take seriously. So my hope is in that transformation will come from younger people who really don't have such high stakes in the previous system and want change and know that their very survival depends on it. And that's both in terms of climate, which I think is one of the most important issues, and in terms of the way that the economic system has been structured. That can't work. That can no longer be sustained. It's not sustainable in Kuwait, and we're going to see that in the very near future. It's already being talked about finally, and globally too. So we'll see, so I'm hopeful, but also, let's say, cautiously hopeful, cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think also I'm noticing the time right now, and there's quite a few questions that have come up. So I want to ask them, but I'll just make a quick comment. I think this also does highlight the potential and once again reiterates the role of stories in potentially changing systems and perhaps changing things in Kuwait, because it is definitely the role of youth, but I think it's also the role of everyone in all different sectors. And also as community builders, it's our role to bring together people across sectors to start building these changes and advocating for these changes. Because in an article that I read by Ella Saltmarsh, which she wrote for the Stanford Social Innovation Review, she frames it very interestingly. She says we can use stories as light, as web, and as glue. They illuminate the past, the present, and the future, and they illuminate paths of change. They highlight faults in the systems and make a visceral case for change. And then she also looks at it as web, which is we can use stories to reauthor the web of the narratives that we live in, and to start to create more change, engender empathy, and build coherence. And so I think it's definitely in bringing the different factions of the community together and start to reintegrate the narrative, or the singular narrative, and pave the way for a more inclusive and cohesive narrative. So just to go back to the questions, there's an anonymous question that was posted, which I wanted to bring up. Here we go. What I understand is that being able to narrate your own story openly is a luxury, meaning not everyone has the opportunity to show up or participate as their whole self for safety reasons, amongst other reasons. For example, the Bidoon, expats, women living with abuse, oppressive parents or partners. How can we use our privilege to be an accomplice in their liberation? How can we unpack different dimensions of our identity to ensure that we can effectively help to disrupt those systems or structures?
I'm not sure it has to necessarily have to do with identity. I think if I'm hearing the question correctly, is how do we use our privilege to give voice or to help and support those who don't have access or who are being oppressed, who are actually in physical danger. I mean, there's that as well. And many have been talking about the effects that this, the pandemic and the quarantine has, especially on women or those who are, under the threat of physical abuse. I mean, this is a very general question. How do you use your privilege to give voice to the voiceless? Is that the question, Leanne? Is that what?
Yeah, that's what I understood from the question.
Well, Rania, do you want to take it? I just wanted to kind of confirm that that's what we were hearing.
Sorry, if I can just jump in. I think basically, so we're saying that we need to be hearing different stories, right? In order to be able to get this comprehensive understanding of what's really happening and identifying different experiences and so on, kind of seeing the whole picture from these different viewpoints. And what the question is referring to is that a lot of these marginalized communities, basically, they cannot share. They're not in a place where they can share their story, because if you're an expat worker in Kuwait and you start sharing your story, or be seen as complaining about your situation, then you get deported, you get sent back home, you lose your job, whatever. Same thing of women in abusive situation and so on, or the Bidoon who
Right, but then I think another part of that question is that can those who have the privilege to speak create a kind of bridge between themselves and these people in a position that don't? And I think the question is kind of answered for that person. I mean, but by the person themselves, like the question seems to have the answer embedded in it, is that yes, you just do it. You do that. You use your voice, you use your capacity, you use your privilege, you use whatever you can to do what you can to kind of, again, illuminate, to use the word that Leanne brought up, the kind of harm that's being done in the name of whatever, in the name of privilege, in the name of, and also making seen what's not seen. That can be done in many ways, through journalism, through writing, through, as I said, the various media that we all have access to. So those who may not have access to, by creating these bridges between those who do and those who don't, you try to assist if you're motivated to do so. But the question is that, are people motivated? So if you are, use it.
But I think that also means doing some deeper work, because I think that if you are in that kind of position of privilege, it also means unpacking that privilege and looking at how you're living your life and how you're contributing inadvertently to a lot of these systems and to a lot of these realities. You can, starting within yourself as well and looking how you're living, and, simple things. Do you employ a staff of 7, and are you paying minimum wage, and are you doing, those kinds of things, that kind of very personal stuff first, to make sure that you're not inadvertently part of the problem. And yes, and then do what work you can, whether it's financial support, whether it's you have connections to power and you can use it to influence change. It depends who you are and what your context is. Yeah.
And also, if I can just jump in and, even speaking from the perspective of, let's say, writing, right? If you're narrating or trying to give voice to those who might not be able to feel safe or able to necessarily narrate their own stories, and even if you are in a more privileged position where you can and try and convey at least those experiences and stories, there's no guarantee that, even if it's coming from your perspective or you're more privileged, there's no guarantee that that's actually even going to still be heard, right? For instance, one of the questions, Lan, you brought up very early on when you were talking to May was censorship, right? Censorship those stories can still be censored, even if they're coming out of different vessels in terms of who's actually, and we speaking from our own experiences there, so you can still be censored for telling those other stories, even if you're more able to do so without being in danger for doing so.
Yeah. There's so much more still to address, I think, and there are a lot of questions that we're getting in, but I think we're running out of time a little bit here. So there's another question that I wanted to bring out from the Q&A that was asked. So another anonymous question: youth, whether they identify as from the minority or majority segment of society, we can't ignore that there is a real struggle for youth in general to find a secure, independent sphere where freedom of expression are not compromised by the single fictional narrative. So our question is, how can we empower youth to shape new spaces to discuss topics that matter?
The easy answer is through the education system, but that's not happening. But, that would be the quickest answer, is through the education system. That's a perfect space. It's a safe space, but it's a space that needs to be deconstructed and reconstructed in order to be effective. But in the meantime, and I'm recently doing research about this, youth are finding spaces for themselves. Youth are creating those spaces for themselves. You look at Niqashna, you look at cross-cultural Diwaniya, they're creating spaces. Are they perfect? No, there's no space that's going to be perfect, but they're working really hard to create spaces that are trying to listen to other voices, that they're trying to reach larger audiences. So, I think what we need to do is give them that freedom and space. Just let them do it and let them do that work. And in the meantime, try to make our schools look more like the spaces they're creating. Learn from them rather than try to teach them maybe in this situation, because they've been doing a lot of interesting stuff even now, even during this crisis. They've been talking, they've been opening up spaces, they've been trying to engage different audiences. So, yeah.
Another thing I think that can help empower youth, I think, and I've been thinking about this even in the context of this crisis, is connections between generations, cross-generational relationships, which are so undervalued and seem rarer and rarer, I think are crucial to passing generational wisdom and experience and lessons learned down to the next generation, so that there doesn't need to be a relearning from scratch again and again. It's one thing to read about it in books, another thing to learn about it in a classroom, but it's quite another to hear it from the mouths of your parents or your grandparents, or even elders that you don't necessarily have any relationship to. I find that really necessary, and I think overlooked. And I think, in fact, the fact that this insidious virus may rob us of an entire generation or two, these irreplaceable worlds that these generations hold, their wisdom, what they've known and experienced, I think is beyond tragic. And I hope that after this passes, one of the things I really hope for, and this generation does survive, I hope, with our help, with the help of youth, really. The youth are in a position to help save that generation in some ways. I think that at the end of this, I hope that generation or those generations' worth is valued and utilized, really tapped into for empowerment, for finding maybe different or innovative ways forward through a cross-generational connection.
Again, as a historian, that's why I think, and it going back to our theme of storytelling, that's why I love oral history, right? For precisely that reason. And, Leanne took my oral history class, and that experience of, like you said, sitting with elders that you don't know and just hearing their stories and experiences. I mean, to me, whenever I've sat and done that, it teaches me more about, like in my work on Kuwait, that's taught me more than anything I could have gotten from any archives or things like that, is to hear those stories directly. And so, yeah, I think it's imperative. I mean, like you said, anyway, a lot of the generations, before us were, like, most of the people that I had interviewed for my dissertation who are alive before oil are gone now. But once you can start documenting and hearing those stories, I think that's also truly important. Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I muted, or can you guys hear me?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. I'm so sorry to everyone in the audience who didn't get a chance, that we didn't get a chance to answer all of your questions. I mean, I think we can go on for another 2 hours very easily. There's definitely a lot more to unpack here, but unfortunately, because of time, we need to wrap. So I just want to ask if anyone has any closing remarks or any points that they wanted to mention but didn't get a chance to at all. Farah, Rania, May, maybe Eleanor or Lisa.
I mean, no, I think what we said covers it, but I just want to kind of thank you guys again for doing this work in the midst of everything going on. I think my sisters and I were not hesitant to do it, but maybe kind of, we go up and down, right? Like everybody else with everything that's going around, or everything that's going on around us. But I think that I can speak for my little sisters and say that we're happy that we did this. And I think it was really productive and really inspiring, for at least for me, and I'm sure for them as well. But
yes, I agree, definitely. It's hard to talk about these things in the middle of these things, but yes, I agree with May that it felt important and good to do it. So thanks for the space to do that.
And thank you for including me from across the other side of the world too. It's nice to be on it. It's been a while since the three of us have been on a panel of some sorts together too, so that was nice.
Yeah, it was definitely very special having all three of you here with us. So thank you so much for being a part of it. This was definitely such a rich conversation. I'm sure that we're going to be spending, and I can probably speak on behalf of a lot of the people that are attending this, that we're going to spend quite a few days unpacking a lot of the things that came up. And this is deep work. It's the role of story, I think, is really large on both the individual and collective level. And I think it has such a powerful role and potential in changing the systems that we exist in. So I'm feeling very hopeful, or at least I'm choosing to feel very hopeful about this. So thank you guys so much once again. It was really great having you. Before we wrap, I just want to say to anyone who is curious to continue with us and continue with the series, we have one more episode that we're going to be hosting next week, same time, 6 to 7 p.m. on Monday. And this is going to be an exciting one. We're going to bring back some of the storytellers that we worked with in our festival last year. And we're going to have a little roundtable and ask them questions about what the process or experience was like of digging deeper into their own personal narratives, what that experience was like, whether it was transformative, what it highlighted for them, the process of sharing their personal and vulnerable narratives and experiences with a group of strangers. So if anyone is interested in joining that, then feel free to do so next week. And otherwise, thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Have a lovely evening and morning, Farah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you to everyone attending as well.
And thank you for the great questions. I was reading through them. They were really good questions that were asked.
Thank you. Thank you so much.